The story begins in the heart of a seemingly conventional family, although marked by a significant peculiarity. The parents of Diego and Ana, two siblings of similar ages, were people deeply dedicated to their jobs. Since they were very young, Diego and Ana spent most of their time at their grandparents' house. Their parents' work routine was so intense that they could rarely spend time with their children. This distancing was not due to a lack of love, but to the need to ensure the economic stability of the family, which forced the parents to work long hours and to entrust the care of their children to their grandparents. The grandparents' house had become the place where Diego and Ana lived out the experiences of their childhood and adolescence. It was an old building, one of those that seems to contain within its walls the memories of many generations. Around the house there was a large garden full of trees, flowers and bushes, a place where the siblings used to run, play and create fantasy worlds in their childhood games. Inside, the house was decorated with a mix of antique and modern objects, each with a story behind it. There was a grandfather clock in the living room that marked the hours with a familiar sound, dark wooden furniture, and a fireplace that the grandparents used to light on cold days. For Diego and Ana, that house represented the safest and most welcoming place in the world. The grandparents, whom they both loved deeply, had become their main caregivers and a central figure in their daily lives. The grandmother, in particular, was a warm and maternal woman, always attentive to the needs of her grandchildren and willing to pamper them at every opportunity. She was in charge of the small attentions that made each day in that house special. She prepared the children's favorite dishes, told them stories before bedtime, and gave them unconditional love that made them forget, even if temporarily, the absence of their parents. The grandfather, although more serious and reserved in character, was also a fundamental pillar in their lives. His presence was imposing, but always fair and affectionate. Diego and Ana deeply respected him, and he always found a way to teach them life lessons through anecdotes and stories from his own childhood. Although he was not a man of many words, his actions spoke for him, and both Diego and Ana saw him as a figure of authority and wisdom. Over time, the routine at their grandparent house became such a natural part of their lives that, every weekend and during school vacations, the siblings spent entire days at their grandparents' house. There they found respite from the hectic lives of their parents, who, although they loved them deeply, could not dedicate the time they wanted to them. Despite the emotional distance they had from their parents, Diego and Ana grew up feeling loved and safe, thanks to the unconditional love of their grandparents. For the grandparents, the constant presence of Diego and Ana in their lives was a blessing. They felt lucky to be able to see their grandchildren grow, to be an active part of their education and to be able to guide them at every stage of their life. For the grandmother, in particular, Diego represented a special bond. Since he was little, he had always been a loving and caring child towards her, and she considered him a reflection of the youth she had lost. With each passing year, the grandmother felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia as she watched Diego transform from a small child into a young man full of potential. As Diego grew, the grandmother noticed the changes in him. He was no longer the child who used to run around the garden. He was now a tall young man, with an increasingly defined personality and a smile that often reminded her of her own son in his youth. These physical and emotional changes in Diego awakened in the grandmother a series of emotions that she should never have felt. In her mind, these feelings were confusing and contradictory. At first, she tried to justify these thoughts, telling herself that it was simply maternal pride or innocent admiration for the young man Diego was becoming. However, as time went by, that justification began to fade. Instead of just feeling proud of him, the grandmother began to crave his presence, to seek out moments to be alone with him, to look at him in a way that went beyond the natural affection between grandparents and grandchildren. Her obsession grew silently, subtly but steadily, until it became the center of her thoughts. Every time Diego visited the house, the grandmother found ways to get close to him. At first, these approaches seemed natural, gestures of affection that any grandmother might have with her grandson. However, little by little, these gestures became something more. The grandmother began to look for opportunities to touch him with a familiarity that crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable, and when they were alone, their gazes seemed to contain an intensity that Diego could not understand. Diego, for his part, did not notice these changes. For him, his grandmother was still the same loving woman as always. He continued to trust her, not imagining that behind that facade of tenderness, an obsession was brewing that would transform their relationship forever. Diego didn't suspect anything, and continued to visit his grandparents' house with the same frequency, enjoying their company and the family atmosphere that had always made him feel at home. As this obsession grew in his grandmother's mind, Her actions began to become more and more daring. She looked for moments when Diego was alone in his room or in the bathroom, and took advantage of the opportunity to approach and observe him. At those moments, his grandmother felt a mixture of shame and excitement, aware that what she was doing was wrong, but unable to stop herself. These forbidden and disturbing thoughts consumed her, but at the same time made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced for years. His grandmother tried to justify her actions, telling herself that they were harmless, that she wasn't hurting anyone by silently observing him. But with each visit from Diego, the obsession grew more and more intense. It was no longer enough for her to simply look at him. She needed more. She needed to find a way to get closer to him, to cross the line that had been hovering in her mind for so long. Every weekend that Diego spent at his grandparents' house was a new opportunity for her. His grandmother looked for excuses to be alone with him, to start conversations that seemed trivial but always ended in flattering comments about Diego. "You have become a very handsome man," she would say to him sometimes, with a look that Diego found strange but which he tried to ignore. Things got to a point where Grandma couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. In her mind, she had convinced herself that her attraction to Diego was something inevitable, something she couldn't control. Little by little, she let go of the idea that those feelings were wrong, and began to think that maybe, in some twisted way, it was okay to act on them. Grandma began to manipulate Diego emotionally, taking advantage of the trust and affection he felt for her. Diego, completely oblivious to his grandmother's intentions, continued to act normally, although he was beginning to notice that something in their relationship had changed. His grandmother's intense stares and increasingly personal comments made him uncomfortable, but he preferred not to think too much about it, attributing it to an excess of affection on her part. However, Grandma had other plans in mind. As Diego turned 20, his relationship with his grandmother became increasingly tense and fraught with an awkwardness that he could not fully understand. His grandmother, who until then had maintained an attitude of innocent and familiar affection, began to behave in a way that crossed the boundaries of convention. Diego, although he trusted her and saw her as a protective figure, began to notice details that he could not ignore. It all began in a subtle way, almost imperceptible to someone who did not know his grandmother closely. She found excuses to be close to Diego, to accompany him at every step inside the house and to observe him with an intensity that he felt but did not understand. Every time they were alone, his grandmother came a little closer than necessary, and in those moments, Diego felt a mixture of discomfort and strangeness that confused him. Despite these signs, he preferred to attribute them to an excess of affection, to his grandmother's devotion to him, without suspecting the true intentions hidden behind these gestures. Over time, the grandmother's obsession intensified until it became an insatiable need to be close to Diego, to see him and find ways to touch him or be in physical contact with him. It was no longer enough for her to just look at him in silence. She needed more, something that consumed her and that drove her to act in ways she would never have imagined. Each visit from Diego became a kind of ritual in which the grandmother looked for any excuse to be by his side, to engage in conversations that seemed innocent but always ended in flattery towards him. One day, taking advantage of an afternoon when the grandfather had gone out and his sister Anna was at a university activity, the grandmother approached Diego with a proposal. She suggested that they spend time in the garden, remembering the games they used to play when he was a child. Although the idea seemed a little strange to him, Diego accepted, thinking that it would be a way to relive pleasant moments from his childhood. However, as soon as they began to spend time together, he noticed that his grandmother's attitude was different. As they walked through the garden, his grandmother began to throw him flattering comments. "You have become a very attractive man, Diego," she said, with a smile that Diego perceived as something more than a simple family compliment. Although he tried not to give it importance, his grandmother's tone of voice and the way she looked at him caused him an uneasiness that he could not get out of his mind. Every time he tried to change the subject, she would return the conversation to him, to his appearance, and to the special relationship they had. His grandmother, taking advantage of the fact that they were alone and that the situation was favorable, began to physically approach Diego in an increasingly obvious way. At first, he tried to see these gestures as normal displays of affection, but soon he realized that there was something else behind them. The grandmother's hands remained on his shoulder a little longer than necessary, and her gaze, far from being the loving gazes he remembered from his childhood, was now deeper, almost devouring. The emotional manipulation escalated little by little. The grandmother, aware of Diego's discomfort, began to use a soft and reassuring tone of voice, convincing him that there was nothing wrong with their relationship, that it was simply a show of special affection between them. "We are family, Diego. You don't have to feel uncomfortable with me," she repeated, trying to make him see that what she felt and showed was normal. With each word, the grandmother tried to manipulate Diego's thoughts, making him feel guilty for his own doubts. He, confused and not knowing how to react, began to doubt himself. He thought that perhaps his discomfort was just a product of his imagination, of his inability to understand his grandmother's displays of affection. However, deep down, something inside him kept telling him that this was not normal. The situation reached its peak one afternoon when the grandmother found Diego alone in his room, organizing some of his belongings. Taking advantage of the fact that they were alone, she entered without warning and sat on the bed, observing him in silence for a few moments before beginning to speak. "You are such a special young man, Diego," she said to him in a low, emotional voice. "You have always been my favorite. I have always felt something special for you." Diego, paralyzed by the intensity of her words, tried to respond politely, but his discomfort was evident. However, the grandmother did not seem to stop. She got out of bed and approached him, placing a hand on his face and looking at him with an expression that left no room for doubt. At that moment, Diego tried to move away, but the grandmother gently held him, saying that he shouldn't be afraid, that she only wanted the best for him. The grandmother's words and her increasingly bold gestures confused Diego, who, in that moment of vulnerability and manipulation, ended up giving in. That innocent and familiar bond that had united them all their lives was transformed into something dark and secret. A relationship that both knew was wrong but from which neither seemed able to escape. The grandmother, blinded by her obsession, convinced herself that it was love, a forbidden love that should be kept silent. After that afternoon, the relationship between them changed completely. Diego, trapped in a situation that consumed him with shame and fear, began to distance himself emotionally from his family. Although he tried to act normally and hide what was happening, guilt tormented him silently. He felt like he could no longer look at himself or his sister Anna in the same way. Shame and fear of being discovered kept him in constant anguish. The grandmother, on the other hand, became increasingly possessive. She took advantage of every opportunity to be alone with Diego, to reaffirm her feelings and to emotionally manipulate him. She convinced him that no one could understand their relationship, that the two of them had a special bond that no one else would understand. "This is just between us," she repeated to him every time he hesitated or tried to get away. "No one else must find out." Diego found himself in a dead-end situation. His grandmother's manipulation and the emotional pressure she put on him kept him trapped, unable to break away from that toxic relationship. Although he tried to find ways to avoid her or get away, the grandmother always found a way to hold him back, to make him feel that the only person he could trust was her. The weight of that secret relationship began to affect Diego's life in a way he could not control. His behavior changed, and both his sister and his grandfather noticed that something was wrong with him. Anna, especially, began to suspect that something was happening, since Diego was no longer the cheerful and friendly young man he used to be. His conversations became evasive, and his attitude reflected a sadness and a concern that he could not hide. The situation reached such a point that Anna, worried about her brother, decided to confront him. She asked him if he was going through any problems, if there was something that had him so distressed. Although Diego tried to deny his feelings and evade the questions, finally, overwhelmed by the pressure, he ended up confessing the truth to his sister. Upon hearing those words, Anna was in a state of shock. She could not believe what Diego was telling her. The image of her grandmother, the woman who had always been a figure of love and care for both of them, was crumbling before her in the most painful way. Anna felt betrayed and deeply hurt, unable to process that someone whom they had both loved and respected all their lives could betray that trust in such a perverse way. After a few moments of silence, Anna, still in shock, decided that they had to take action. Anna's world fell apart when she heard her brother's confession. The grandmother, the woman who had cared for them since they were children, whom they trusted and loved deeply, had crossed unthinkable limits. Anna tried to stay strong, but emotions overwhelmed her. Indignation, betrayal, and a contained fury that ran through her body. Despite the confusion, she knew she could not let this continue. Diego, visibly affected, explained to his sister how the grandmother had emotionally manipulated him, convincing him that their relationship was something special and unique that no one else could understand. Anna could see the burden of guilt and shame that weighed on her brother. Diego, in his desperation, begged her not to tell anyone else. He was afraid of the consequences, of what could happen if this truth came to light. But Anna, aware of the seriousness of the situation, decided that this could not go unpunished. After thinking about it overnight, Anna made a decision. She knew she couldn't figure this out alone, and although it was difficult for her, she understood that Grandpa needed to know the truth. He, too, had a right to know about the betrayal that had occurred under his own roof. The next day, while Diego was out of the house, Anna approached Grandpa and asked to speak privately. Her voice trembling and filled with nervousness, she began to relate what she had discovered. At first, Grandpa listened without fully understanding Anna's words. The idea that his wife, with whom he had shared his entire life, was capable of such a thing was inconceivable to him. But as Anna gave him more details, Grandpa's face changed. He went from disbelief to horror, and from horror to a silent rage that seemed to consume him from within. He stood up from his chair, unable to stay in the same place, and began to pace the living room, processing what he had just heard. Anna watched Grandpa in silence, feeling the tension in the air. The fury emanating from him was palpable, but he didn't say a single word. After several minutes, Grandpa finally spoke, his voice filled with bitterness and pain. "I can't believe she did this. She betrayed us all, betrayed our trust in our family." The betrayal Grandpa felt wasn't just toward Diego and Anna, but toward himself as well. He had shared an entire life with his wife, believing her to be a person of integrity and trustworthy. Now, everything he thought he knew about her had crumbled in an instant. The pain and shame were unbearable, and though he tried to maintain his composure, his hands shook with suppressed rage. After a long silence, Grandpa turned to Anna and expressed his thoughts. "We can't let this continue. We can't let her continue to cause harm to this family." Although they both knew that a direct confrontation could be dangerous and risky, they understood that they had to do something. The consequences of exposing the scandal publicly would be devastating for everyone, and especially for Diego, who was already deeply affected by what had happened. It was then that the grandfather proposed a drastic and definitive solution. They would make it look like a natural death. At first, Anna was surprised and reluctant to the idea. She could not imagine that they would go to that extreme, but as the grandfather explained his reasons, she began to understand. The grandfather explained that, in this way, they could protect Diego and the family from a scandal that would destroy them all. It would be a silent revenge and a form of justice. The plan was carefully thought out. Grandma had always been in charge of the kitchen and family meals, and Grandpa knew exactly how to act without raising suspicion. They decided that during the next family reunion, they would take advantage of it to carry out the plan. Grandma, confident that her secret was safe, did not suspect at all what they were planning against her. The family reunion arrived, and the atmosphere in the house was a mixture of tension and coldness. Diego, although unaware of the plan, maintained an emotional distance from Grandma, which she noticed but could not fully understand. Anna and Grandpa, for their part, tried hard to act normally, although Grandma's presence caused them deep revulsion. For Grandma, that reunion was an opportunity to be close to her grandchildren, especially Diego, without suspecting that this meeting would be the last. During the meal, Grandpa prepared a special dish for Grandma. Without raising any suspicions, she mixed a small dose of poison into the food, making sure that the amount was enough to cause a death that seemed completely natural. The grandmother, oblivious to the truth, began to eat without noticing anything strange. The conversation flowed in a forced manner, with awkward silences and evasive glances, but the grandmother did not seem to notice the tension. As the meal progressed, Anna and the grandfather observed every movement of the grandmother, waiting for the first signs of the poison taking effect. The grandmother, without suspecting anything, continued eating and smiling, trying to maintain an appearance of normality. However, after a few minutes, she began to feel strange. At first, she attributed it to a simple malaise, but soon the symptoms intensified. She felt like she was short of breath, her heart was beating uncontrollably, and a cold sweat began to run down her forehead. The grandmother tried to hide her discomfort, but it was obvious that something was not right. Anna and the grandfather watched her in silence, holding their breath as they watched her struggle between life and death. The grandmother tried to stand up, but her legs trembled, and she finally fell to her knees, unable to stand. The scene unfolded in an almost deathly silence, and although the grandmother tried to call for help, the words would not come out of her mouth. Finally, after a few moments of agony, the grandmother stopped breathing. Anna and the grandfather exchanged an emotional look. They both knew that it had been necessary, that it was the only way to end the threat she represented to the family. Diego, for his part, watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and confusion. not fully understanding what had just happened. The grandfather, maintaining his role until the end, called an ambulance and explained to the paramedics that his wife had suddenly collapsed during the meal. The doctors declared the death as natural, without anyone suspecting the truth behind that death. The family managed to keep the secret, and the grandmother was publicly remembered as the loving woman she had always pretended to be. However, for Ana, Diego and the grandfather, that day marked a before and after in their lives. The grandmother's death, although it seemed to have brought peace, left an indelible mark on the family.